Welcome back. Next up, we'll be having our panel 4 on incorporating trade strategy into supply chain decision making. And our moderator for this panel session is none other than Mr. Frank Debets. Mr. Frank Debets, please. And what's a panel session without our speakers? So for today, our speakers include Mr. Lim Teck Leng, Mr. Raymond Ma, Mr. Scott McKenzie, Mr. Gregory Nichols, Mr. Parash Kaka, and lastly, Mr. Neil Johnson. So now I'll just pass on my time to Frank Debets to commence with the panel session. Mr. Frank, please.
Well, why don't you guys come up here? I feel a bit lonely. I feel a bit like a rock star. I was just saying to one of my fellow panelists, you sit so far away from us. I expect some security guards in front here to shield us from all the people that want to rush up to the stage and talk to us. Okay, thanks. Calm down, guys. Thanks everybody for coming back and spending some time with us. As you just heard, my name is Frank Debets. I lead a customs and trade consulting practice within PwC around Asia. We've got about 100 people that are fully dedicated to customs and trade consulting, working in this market or in this part of the world to kind of help companies deal with all the challenges and difficulties of moving products cross-border. So that links quite nicely into the theme of this group and this conference. Perhaps a couple of words about myself. I joined PW about 20 years ago in 1994 in London, and that has some relevance because for those of you that may be able to think that far back, that was the year that the European Union's internal market took off. And clearly these days there's a lot of press reporting, a lot of interest in the ASEAN economic community. And if we have time, we kind of touch on why that's entirely different from the EU internal market. But the interest is similar, and the way companies are responding to it is very similar. And maybe give you an example as to how somebody could get it very, very wrong. One of my first projects when I was in the office in London, it was an American company, no disrespect to any Americans in the audience, and they looked at this and they thought, oh, internal market, we have all these offices and facilities around Europe, we don't need that anymore. We can streamline, we can become much more efficient, and they did a lot of planning, and then they looked at the map, and they looked at Europe and they thought, you know, Switzerland, nicely in the middle, very good logistics, we hear good things about it, nice country to live, tax breaks. So that's where they set up a warehouse, a manufacturing, and their headquarters, until somebody said, yeah, but Switzerland is not actually in the EU. And it also has no agreements with the Eastern European markets. So it becomes harder to get our products into Eastern Europe, whereas the EU has got all these partnership agreements with Central and Eastern Europe. So it was a good example as to where, for all the other reasons, the right location was chosen. But from a trade perspective, it was entirely the wrong selection of location, both for manufacturing as well as for warehousing and even for some of the headquarter functions. And the company had to go back and open a secondary facility in Germany, in southern Germany, at an enormous cost. So, you know, when you look at the topic of this session, it's trade strategy. Many people will think of trade and customs probably last. It's some clerks that sit at the port and fill out some paperwork. Usually it only bubbles up in importance if something goes wrong. And I think we'll see that a little bit in this panel as well from some of the specialists who say, well, you know, I've got a very bad name in my organization or in my world because I'm always the person who creates the problem or comes and says that something is hard to achieve. The other thing that I just want to kind of touch on very briefly is that in my experience of the past 20 years, there's been a shift back in the way companies deal with customs and trade compliance into supply chain areas and logistics areas of organizations. This is even when I came out to Asia 15 years ago, we ourselves were part of a supply chain management team as consultants, and in many organizations that where the focus was. And then there was this shift because there was such a big focus on duty reductions, particularly driven by FDA negotiations. But in many organizations also linking customs to other indirect taxes that were emerging in the region. So suddenly the responsibility for customs and trade compliance shifted to a tax or a finance function. And I think with reducing duty rates and with increasing internationalization around this region, we clearly see a shift back to that responsibility fitting within a supply chain functionality, a logistics functionality. Because two of the biggest challenges and two of the biggest areas that companies are interested in are securing the supply chain, because it's clearly a key topic in the minds of even the CEOs, but also making the supply chain efficient. And when we talk to people that have a customs and trade responsibility in their supply chain, where 5 or 10 years ago they were all looking, their key performance indicator was reducing duty costs. These days, when we do the surveys, you can do the survey, it's still open at our booth, we're doing a trade compliance survey around the region. They're saying, well, the top priority is efficiency, reducing clearance time and predictability for their organizations. So whether or not you pay $1 million in duties or $1.5 million in duties matters less as to whether your products clearly or smoothly and cleanly clear customs at various borders. And when you look at the AmCham Business Outlook survey that was released last week, in all but, and I think that Young will be happy to hear that, in all the countries in ASEAN, customs comes out probably worst as the authority to deal with and the difficulties at the border, other than in Singapore, where it comes out best. So we might try and touch on that. So the panel's objectives is in the next 55 minutes to clarify all of that for you, make it easy to deal with. There's a bit of a challenge for everybody, I'm not going to go around and let everybody talk for 5 or 10 minutes about their views on the topic, because you would have no chance to ask any questions. But what I will ask everybody to do is quickly introduce themselves and give maybe 1 or 2 lines as to why they think this topic is important and where their focus is. So maybe, Taek Leong, if I can start with you.
Hi, I'm Taek Leong from Singapore Customs. Just a brief introduction. I've been in customs for a number of years, but I don't consider myself a specialist. Dealt with various aspects of customs work, ranging from free trade agreement to enforcement work, etc. Currently, I run basically anything that deals with trade and customs comes under my purview. So feel free to ask anything later.
Hi, my name is Paraj Kakkar. I'm the founder and MD of a venture called Assurance Box, which provides a managed service for compliance control for the industry. I have a background in the software business and in the logistics and supply chain business over the last few years. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Scott McKenzie. I'm the Regional Trade Compliance Manager for Hewlett-Packard. I think it's probably appropriate that I'm on the far left as an Australian on this panel. So But yes, I've been living here in Singapore for almost 7 years, working in trade compliance for 20 plus years, had locations, or in locations such as Thailand, but focusing primarily on Southeast Asia. Over those years, I've seen trade compliance, well, a number of significant changes in trade compliance as particularly multinationals such as HP adapt to the opportunities here in Asia. So I'm happy to share some thoughts on some of the questions that Frank, I know, has planned for us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raymond Ma. I'm actually the Trade Compliance Director for the Invensys Asia Pacific business. And we are actually a UK automation company, but we have recently just joined Schneider Electric, so group of company being part of their bigger family now. So my key responsibility for the Invensys business across Asia Pacific is to facilitate and ensure compliance in terms of their customs and trade related matters in the region itself. So like what Scott has mentioned is we are seeing a different in terms of the trend, in terms of the focus, with the change of the focus of trade from the Europeans as well as the US markets to the Asia Pacific markets. So with that, the authorities from the relevant countries are moving in terms of their focus in this area. And that's where we can see a lot of activities that's happening in this area itself. So looking forward to answer any questions and assisting any matters from my end.
Hi, good morning. I'm Greg Nichols, part of the same practice at PwC as Frank. Frank's my boss, actually. I lead the Singapore practice of about 10 people. Here in Singapore, I guess because Singapore Customs is a pretty trade facilitative organization, as Frank was mentioning, what our team does largely is helping companies that are maybe based in Singapore or have an RHQ in Singapore to coordinate the larger regional projects where they're having difficulties or where they're trying to achieve synergies or strategize around global trade in the region generally.
Morning, everyone. My name is Neil Johnson. I'm the founder and director of TradeNet Services. Most people who are familiar with us will know us as TNets. And if you get a chance, please come along to our booth over there and take a look at our fabulous celebrity endorsers this morning. We tackle the subject from, I guess, a lower level in that our business is all about the day-to-day activities required for the actual trade compliance process. So we process more than 1 million customs declarations per annum, so way more than 10% of Singapore's total volume. We work for freight forwarders. We also work for shippers, traders, agents. The key theme that we have running for this year is raising awareness of advanced export declaration, which was introduced by Teck Leong's team the 1st of April last year. There's an adjustment period which comes to an end on the 30th of September this year at midnight, and after that, the consequences for failure to comply will be dire. Penalties, delays, and potential loss of customs facilities. So, please, if anybody wants to come and chat to us about that, our booth is manned. Happy to discuss that. Thank you.
Okay, so now you know who we've got on the panel here. I'm going to be asking them some questions, not necessarily expecting everybody to comment on everything. Once I get a bit bored with them, I might reach out to the floor and see whether you got any exciting questions for any of them. But looking at the theme of this session, trade strategy and how you incorporate it in supply chain decision making, it kind of implies that not all companies get it right all the time, or perhaps that there's lessons to be learned as to how you do this better. And maybe my first question, and if I may, I'll start with you, Teck Leong, because you clearly see a lot of companies, is, where do you typically see companies go wrong, and why do you believe they go wrong, and kind of perhaps what should they be doing to avoid the kind of problems that you encounter?
Yeah, I think in general, I would say in the context of Singapore, most companies are legitimate companies. They want to comply. The mistakes we see, or the errors, whether quite technical, non-compliance or fraudulent, part of them are technical compliance because we don't think there's any fraudulent intent. It's largely to do with your declarations, whether you declare something wrongly or you forgot to declare something. And that can span from the revenue perspective to the security perspective as well. I would say over the last few years that has improved quite a fair bit because of the various sessions we had to raise awareness, especially in the area of export control. In the early days, there was quite a fair bit of confusion, lack of awareness of export control regime in Singapore, and you have a lot of companies who either didn't declare the correct permit or think that the item is not controlled. So that was, I think we think the crux of the problem was awareness, rather than a real intent not to declare. Yeah. So by and large, we don't think we have a huge compliance problem here in Singapore. Largely also because our taxes are low. We only have 4 duty-buy items, and GST is 7%, which you can account from IRAS. So there's revenue-wise, there's less incentive to do it. I also would say in the context of Singapore, where the rule of law is strong, generally people are more compliant than, not only in customs laws, but in other government regulations as well. People tend to be more compliant than I think most other countries. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. And maybe I think you're kind of right, because there's a less of a revenue focus, perhaps therefore there's less of a concern. And as I mentioned in the survey, it was clear that around the region, many of the people here that might have a regional responsibility, things might not be as easy. And we can kind of come back to that as well. And I want to maybe, Greg, ask you, because on the same question, because you work with a whole range of companies. where do you see them go wrong, and what could they possibly do to avoid getting into a trade trouble?
Sure. I mean, I think with regards to Singapore companies or Singapore-based companies, what Teck Long said is probably very true. Where we do see, I guess where it becomes apparent maybe if they're non-compliant is generally in the other countries. So if they're exporting, to China or to India or to Korea, where there's a problem there, particularly around, say, the use of free trade agreements, then if it turns out that they're not able to prove their origin that actually originates in Singapore, then the problem, generally speaking, in Singapore maybe comes to light outside of Singapore when it's being imported into the destination country. I mean, I think the types of problems that we often see, and I think it's quite well reflected in the preliminary results from our survey that Frank mentioned, are around tariff classification. Definitely there's still a lot of, I guess, ambiguity on tariff classifications in the region. Many companies that we talk to don't necessarily have very strong controls around their tariff classifications that are being used. Customs valuation is a big issue, so the values that are declared to customs and whether or not they include all the elements that need to be included and whether or not they're defendable. And then I guess the third major topic is probably around free trade agreements, and that's something that I guess traditionally a couple countries in the region, mostly Korea and China to a certain extent, have been challenging a lot of FTA claims, but we're starting to see more and more, I guess, a trend towards that in other countries in the region as well.
Okay, so we had two views from the outside in, so let's go to our corporates with Scott and Raymond. On this topic, maybe a slightly different spin to the same question. How do you, because you've got a responsibility in your organization for trade compliance, how do you go about convincing other people, be that in supply chain or in finance or even at CEO level, that this is important? And how can you, what do you need to do to make sure that the right attention is paid, but you don't go over the top?
So for myself, I think the approach I've always been taking in terms of getting engagement from the various stakeholders, including the management level, is really to allow them in terms of understanding that our role in organization is not really to stop transaction or stop trade, but more towards assisting them in facilitating trade in a compliant manner. So once you are able to get that approach across, and with that understanding that we are actually, in fact, trying to make their delivery in a more smoother manner, they're technically more willing to work with us in terms of that aspects. And also at the same time, while understanding that approach, what we usually do is also to do a cost risk analysis for them to understand, by inputting a certain amount, what is the potential risk that they are able to mitigate in that aspects. And, from a risk perspective or mitigation perspective, in terms of investment, it may be quantifiable for 100Ks to even $1 million. But, from a non-compliance perspective, that's the risk where it may not be quantifiable. And of course, for those companies that, has challenges in terms from a regulation perspective, you understand that the time, effort, resource, if you be in a position of non-compliance. So sometimes it really helps in terms of also the experience of the companies by itself as well. So Scott, how about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. Yeah, I think my comments will echo what Raymond has shared. We in HP spend a lot of time consulting with our business, focusing on communication. There's a couple of reasons why we do that. Obviously, the businesses are changing rapidly to reflect the needs of our customers and future customers. So it's very important that we understand where they're going as far as countries that they're targeting, supply chain models. But also we have a role to educate, and this is something I reinforce with my team, that we need to make businesses aware of the compliance risk. But that in itself isn't a particularly attractive conversation for business. Business are aware that there's the importance of regulatory control, but at the same time, by nature, they see it as an inhibitor. So we need to sweeten that. And the way we do that is we try and promote the fact that we see trade compliance as an enabler and in some cases to provide a competitive advantage. So typically that's how we try and present our position to, or our role to our internal business stakeholders, is that really two sides of the coin, being that we have a compliance role and we must ensure that HP maintains its reputation as a highly compliant company. But at the same time, we want to be aggressive with our approach to trade facilitation and make sure we're taking full advantage of the various opportunities that are out there that our competitors may not necessarily be taking aware of, or even or taking advantage of, or even be aware of. Classic example of that is free trade agreements. Only 5 years ago, the free trade agreement activity in our industry, at least across this region, was very low. But competition has forced a change in thinking, and I've seen that in HP. In the past, when I used to speak to businesses about FTA opportunities, they were less so interested because of the complexities involved in supporting that. But the competitive environment has changed that situation, and now they're actively coming to my group seeking advice on that. So that's where we can position to say, well, if we do this right, it can be a competitive advantage for us. We can look also at other opportunities like the various FTZs, other programs designed like AEO to facilitate trade across the region. So I think that's really how we like to see the integration aspect being placed with business, is showing both sides of the house, the compliance side, but also the opportunity that trade facilitation can provide.
I'm just going to stay with you for a second, and we're going to start with a little anecdote and get your view on an example that I dealt with. This was in Taiwan, and a company that, like so many companies in Asia, this was an MNC. They kind of dipped their toe into various territories through a joint venture. Okay, so they had a partner that was importing their products into Taiwan, one of the bigger Taiwanese trading companies, and getting it to market. Business was good, business was growing. So at some stages, MNC said, well, actually, we'd like to take control back of that supply chain. We'd like to have more say in what we do in that market. So they did it. They set up an entity, and they then said, oh, well, we're going to have to move our own products into the country. We have no capability. We've got no brokers. We don't really know what to do. But you know what? They didn't want to outsource it, so we want to take it in-house. So they said, you know what, this company that's been helping us do this, we're just going to take their 3 staff that worked on our imports, and they're just going to, and it was all very amicable. So they moved into this organization, and they started trading it. And on day one, what happened from Taiwan authorities' perspective, they were a new importer. So it was the same product, it was the same box, it was the same shipper, it was the same person doing the declaration, but it was 100% inspection. And they were time-sensitive goods. So they immediately had a supply chain problem. So the question, I guess, coming back to your previous thing, do we just have to accept that, because that's a very esoteric point, do you just have to accept that from time to time things will go wrong? Or is there sufficient you can do in an organization to make sure that you're involved early enough to avoid those kind of problems? And if so, how many trade compliance specialists do you need? And I'm asking you because I know that HP's got a big team, and other companies might have
that's
one
more
or
than
a
one
half.
question, Frank. Yeah, there's a couple of aspects there, and I'll try and do my best to address them. So I think certainly in this part of the world, and I guess it's not unique to Asia. I mean, there's opportunities with developing markets in North America and Europe, but particularly Asia is the focus, at least for Hewlett-Packard, and that presents challenges for us because the business get excited about the numbers, the demographics, the uptake of IT, the population. It's amazing the numbers that they throw out, but often the downside of these emerging markets is the regulatory environment is not particularly transparent, and in often cases evolving. And they have competing forces as well. You've got governments that are trying to ensure that local industry is fairly represented. They're trying to build platforms that attract multinationals to invest, not simply import their products. So that dynamic does make it very challenging for us to go in. And often, partners that we've been using in the past, because of their local expertise, are more apt at managing that. They're more integrated with the local authorities and how things work. So when you have that change, it is difficult, but frankly, we find there's a tipping point. Okay, there's a point that we'll go as far as we can with our partners, and then we'll make the decision that we will transition. Now, when we do make that decision with business, I make it very clear that don't expect this to be seamless. We're going to have challenges. will be seen differently initially, and there may be certain countries that try and take advantage of the fact that we're new to the market, and that'll present challenges to us ethically as well. So the business have to be mindful that that transition is not something that we can take lightly. And in some cases, we've even advised against it. Unless the volumes are really there, the volumes are substantial, we know we have the business case to support, we'll discourage that until they're very confident that we can take this alone. As far as the people aspect, I think that also is one of my biggest challenges here in Asia, is that we're seeing a rapidly evolving regulatory environment. And keeping pace with that is a problem. So the natural reaction to that from corporate is, well, let's just get more people. We'll put people in country. That'll help. But frankly, that's not the only answer, because with boots on the ground, that does help. But unless you've got the right skill set, and this is the challenging piece, particularly in Asia, because trade compliance is not something that was... it was kind of an add-on, I guess you could say, to the logistics aspect, right? The compliance piece was something you did in addition to moving the freight. Now, of course, with the evolution of the regulatory environment, particularly in our emerging markets, it's becoming something that requires a specific skill set. And finding people with those skill sets is, particularly in some of these emerging markets, is very difficult. But, and like most multinationals, we're moving away from a practice of putting in expats. There's pros and cons to that, but essentially from a cost perspective, it's much more effective for us if we can find good local talent. So that's one of my challenges, is to find good local talent across Asia.
So if you're out there looking for a job, Scott needs you. So if people can't do it, can computers maybe changing tack a little bit? Now, before I get particularly Paraj and Neil to comment on that. And another anecdote, I was talking to a client, this is probably about 8-9 years ago, and this was a global MNC, and they'd done some work internally because they said, well, what can we automate further in our organization? And they looked at all their functions, and they had an outside company assess to what extent a function could be automated. So, for example, HR staff evaluation is probably hard to automate. You can create some forms on a computer, but you need a human to assess the performance of another human, by and large. Whereas other areas you can fully automate quite easily. Invoice processing could be automated, etc., etc. Now, customs and trade actually ended up surprisingly far on the human side of the scale, not on the automated side. And some of the reasons for that were things like, how do you determine whether a product is dual use? Hard for a computer that doesn't have advanced kind of artificial intelligence to do. Even things that might be easier automatable, like FTA management, etc. There was actually quite a lot of human intervention required, just because of the way the customs rules work, because customs legislation is not always that straightforward and sometimes even ambiguous. So maybe perhaps start with you. Like, what have the advances been in the past 10 years? We see a lot of new systems out there. How does that help? What is the value it brings to trade compliance? And where are the shortcomings? How far does it go? And what else would you need in a company?
Sure, thanks. No, so I think you're right. I think that, in the spectrum of throwing more people at the problem and using software better, you do have to find a better balance. And actually, to be perfectly candid, I think not as much in Asia, but at least overseas, perhaps in in some other markets, there are some absolutely fabulous software tools available. Governance, risk, compliance tools are very rapidly being developed everywhere, and I think you now have increasing access to more tools than you did earlier. So I think from a tool development and understanding of what you can automate, there is more availability now. I'd actually shift the conversation a little bit. From the perspective of being compliant, of understanding what you need to do in the first place, the first job is that for most companies, I can't think of a single executive that wakes up in the morning and says, I don't want to be compliant. Everybody wants to be compliant, right? The issue is that in many cases, whether whether it is large corporations like Scott's or other companies, what do I need to do? Where do I go if I wake up and I say, look, I'm running a business, I have many things to do, including primarily serving my customers and doing what it takes to serve my customers. What do I need to do to understand how to be compliant? And so I think one of the things that we could do in this region, perhaps, is, and this is an industry topic, it has nothing to do with the company. As from an industry standpoint, perhaps we could do more to create awareness by pulling together information of what you need, what regulations are out there, what kind of trade protocols exist, and just developing a common pool from which then I can choose to undertake specific tasks to interpret that information and deliver a certain level of compliance within my organization. So from an industry standpoint, what I'd suggest we do is that I think there are some great tools, great software, but perhaps what we could do more of is to manage the information that you need to be compliant. And of course, Singapore does a great job. Singapore is just absolutely fabulous. But I think it might be something that we could do in other markets in the region.
Yeah, and I'd second that a little bit, because I know a lot of the systems have a great infrastructure, but the companies struggle to get the content in. I know it because they come and ask me, and I say, well, it's difficult.
That's right. That's right.
And it changes all the time.
That's right.
Maybe, Neil, your perspective on this topic?
In terms of automation, there are a phenomenal range of opportunities out there. At the very simplest, probably 80% of the information that's required to fill out a customs declaration in most countries is already in your core SAP or your ERP systems. But we see a frighteningly small number of companies, whether shippers or whether it's the shipper that's leading the declaration process or whether it's the forwarder, a frighteningly small number of companies are willing to embrace a very small change in deployment of technology to use that information. So a handful of companies out there, including ourselves, are really banging the drum very, very hard. Typical scenario, medium-sized company that we went in to see, German manufacturer, they distribute goods from Singapore. We can save the manager there 16 hours a week by putting a very, very simple linkage, standard interface from SAP into our system. The number of emails backwards and forwards and people who need to approve this within that manufacturer's organization back in Germany is just incredible. There's no greater information being shared than what is being shared now. So a lot of the answers are actually right under our noses. I think when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of the customs declaration process, and without kind of speaking out of turn, there is a very major discussion in Singapore right now as to how we can make the entire trade facilitation landscape much more efficient, and that would then place Singapore way ahead of any other country. I think that's really the kind of tip of the iceberg. The greater opportunity is with existing systems, talking to existing systems. And I know that some of the people on the panel are working very hard on this as well, some of the shippers. One of the points that was raised yesterday was that there is a somewhat short-term relationship between the shippers and forwarders. So is that investment worthwhile? And I would say that's open to debate. But we've ourselves built systems which facilitate that process very, very easily. And we're certainly not one of the biggest companies in the world. So it's doable. It's a question of mindset. And I think part of it goes back to the previous question, which is the connect between what goes on at the regional level and what goes on in the field. And we see a huge disconnect. There's very much a top-down approach in terms of trade facilitation policy, trade compliance policy, but it only seeps so far into the organization. And then the bottom-up aspect is that these guys report to a completely different chain of command, and it will be very difficult for a regional trade compliance guy to impose on an operations clerk how to do their work. So that's another issue that's kind of hanging around us, which prevents this wide-scale adoption of a solid, transparent, straight-through trade compliance policy.
So, and maybe following up on that point, you know, can I see it in our organization from a VAT perspective? We have fantastic automation tools, and they're out there. And so people come to us and say, "Oh, you know, VAT customs, it's all roughly the same. So why don't you do the same automation in your area?" And I say, "Well, from a VAT perspective, you have a single document that drives everything, which is your invoice." From a customs perspective, and I might go to take down on this, is you have a whole range of requirements, like, and the requirements of documentation, although in principle it's the same around the world, in practice it's not really. Like, and you've got different, you've got different documents that might be expected by the authorities, but also you've got different data that are being looked for. So maybe bringing it the topic a little bit to the single window question, right? And from your perspective, you know, the ASEAN single window has been talked about, and it's on kind of on everybody's agenda. It was 2 years ago in Jakarta, the meeting. I think every authority in ASEAN did a presentation on the single window, and they all started with the definition, and all the 10 definitions were somewhat different. So, you know, what more can be achieved, I guess, because when you look at the surveys, people are saying, well, one of the biggest things that hinders us is have a single set of requirements. So in our organization, even if we want to automate, we need something slightly different in every territory. Is this something that just in our lifetime will remain wishful thinking, or can you really see kind of under the light of that particular tunnel?
Yeah. Thanks, Frank. I avoided the question during a conference last week. Yeah. Scott and Greg managed to field the questions. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions being asked about AEC, ASEAN Economic Integration Community. Of course, it's supposed to be implemented 2015. I think firstly, AEC has quite a few components. But I think of interest to companies who trade within ASEAN, one question is about ASEAN single window. Will it happen? How will it happen? What animal is ASEAN single window, and when? I think let's be realistic. Before we can, basically the ASEAN single window is not about having a single ASEAN system, declaration system for all 10 ASEAN countries. The approach is basically to have each ASEAN country have its own single window, similarly like us. Likewise, we do have TradeNet, and how you link the various countries, various countries' single window together, so that you can exchange data. Theoretically, you can exchange your electronic Form D across via the system, so that you don't need to carry the multiple copies and cross the border and clear the cargo with the physical copy. So that's the intent of it. But I think before to do that, you need to have each country putting in place, or at least certain countries putting in place a national single window, and a truly national single window. I say that because if you look at international survey, people will say, countries will say they have single window, but you need to question to what extent is a single window. Does it covers all the government agencies that regulate import-export in the country? Does it have a single form that fulfills all the various relevant agency requirements? So that itself is always a question when people, I'll ask when people say they have single window. Okay, so you need to have the various countries having their own full, to a certain extent, the 80-20 talk, single window in place before we can then talk about exchanging data, whether it's Form D or maybe an import or export declaration, to fully enjoy the benefits of a data integration, single form or type of ASEAN facilitation. That itself is, I say, is a big challenge. It's not something that's not doable. It's not a technology issue. Systems out there, various technology out there. We implemented national single window in 1986, so definitely people can do it. But I think the issue at hand is then the willpower of the various country government administration in pulling people together, pulling the different agencies together, knock their heads together, make them give up their turf, especially the legacy systems, make people change their procedures, harmonize the requirements at the national level, such that they have a truly single window. Then we can talk about integration. You look around at the 10 ASEAN countries, other than us, I think very few of them. Malaysia has some single window. I think in my own assessment, Malaysia will be second in place in terms of having a single window. The other countries, I think they are in different stage of development. I think various countries announced that they're setting up single window. And Myanmar is one of them. Philippines profess to have a single window. But as I said, they say they have a single window, but you need to look at it in practice. What does it mean by a single window over there? So 2015, you don't have the ideal single window in place. What we have then will be possible, or not possible, but actually is in place now, is that the various national single window will really be linked up through a network. But at this point in time, I think the various ASEAN countries are still discussing what can be exchanged through that ASEAN single window network. One possibility is a Form D, electronic Form D. But I think there's still quite a few discussions in terms of the format of it, even simple things like the character spacing and things like that. You know, it's easy to talk about integration, but you always often when you go to details, people will discuss and take a long time to discuss and agree on simple things like how many character spacing you require for a certain field, how to record a data field and things like that. So the nitty-gritty always takes time, especially to talk about negotiating or discussing among 10 ASEAN countries. But having said that, I think at Singapore end, we are not just waiting for the ASEAN single window to come to place. Hopefully within our lifetime, I think. But at our end, we're also looking at bilateral linkages with countries who are ready. You don't have to wait for 10, because at the end of the day, you don't trade a good, you don't move a good across 10 countries. Most often than not, it's just within 1 or 2. So at our end, we have TradeNet and we have Trade Exchange. We are exploring like-minded parties or people who are willing, countries out there who already have some form of single window and who are willing to link up with us to see how much can we do. But other than linkages, of course, you need to study whether there's room for you to merge a form together, to harmonize their requirements. There's no point to link up and you still have 2 different forms with different requirements. You should try to achieve some commonality in terms of data requirements, such that at the end of the day, you submit your data once and the data get pumped to the other side and can be reused, so that you don't need to redo data entry, etc. Okay. We do not have any. Okay, we are still in the process of discussing here. As I said, it's not so easy. I just say sign an agreement and do it. There's a lot of discussion, and especially you talk about the other countries whereby they have multiple agencies involved. It may not just be the Malaysian customs or Indonesia customs or Thai customs, or maybe Netherlands even. It could involve the other government agencies as well, and that usually takes time. Compared to us, I mean, Singapore, we believe truly in the whole government approach. We do that. But in other countries, I think you realize that often than not, you need to knock at different government agencies' doors and get things done. And often than not, they may have disagreement, and sometimes or not, or most of the times, a single product may be controlled by more than one agency. And one agency may agree with it, the other agency may disagree with it. And there lies the challenge when you do such trading across the border. Yeah.
I think, thanks. I mean, there's some very good comments and useful comments there. And I think, from my perspective, sort of sitting often between the corporates and the authorities, I've seen, particularly in the last year, a change which I think is a good change, in that from the authority side, I think what was missing in many territories it was kind of an honest assessment as to what is achievable and what are we doing. I mean, there was for political reasons, I'd say, yeah, that's what we committed to, we're going to do it, and therefore the corporates were kind of given up. They're saying, well, the difference between what you're saying and what we see in reality is just so big that there's no point in even talking. And I think as we're nearing closer to 2015, the conversations are getting more honest, and therefore the corporates are starting to become a little bit more involved and saying, well, yeah, but so how can we then help, and what can happen? And this is similar to what happened, again, going back to the EU, and we did a project on the single administrative document and trying to harmonize that between, at that stage, the 15 EU member states. And it took a long time, and exactly as you said, there was data requirements that nobody dared touch, but they're actually not being used. I remember one field in particular, we asked customs, well, why do you require this information? And they said, it's the Ministry of Agriculture needs it. So we went to the Ministry of Agriculture and said, well, why do you need this information? What do you do with it? And they said, well, we don't ask for it. Customs sends it to us every month. So, and I think there may be something, but that needs an open and honest discussion, and maybe needs an outsider to kind of break it open a little bit.
Frank, can I
yeah, sure.
just build on what Ting Leong was saying? I think from our side, seeing the daily flow of transactions going through, and knowing that most of the information that we're keying in will be reused in one form or another on the import side. So every export from Singapore is going to be an import to somewhere else. So we recognize and respect the fact that governments will have this challenge of working together because there are so many complexities. And frankly, we're painting a very rosy picture of Singapore, and it is a shining beacon within ASEAN, certainly. But there are still discrepancies in terms of the way some of the controlling agencies work and the speed at which they work. So respecting that, what we're doing is we're kind of trying to find our peer companies in overseas markets and saying, let's work on a bilateral basis because we have customers for whom we can create value. So if you were to take a declaration that's made in China, that same information for the export will be reused in, say, Germany. If most of the declaration for the import is done at the time of export, that's a huge saving in value, huge saving in cost. So that's kind of our broader philosophy, and that's what we're now working towards. And so I think when governments are finally ready to have this kind of wholehearted exchange of information, and then at least we'll have a commercial solution in place or the makings of one. But it's changing the corporate mindset so that that information can be shared.
Just to add on, while highlighted that there are challenges and complexities in doing cross-border integration from a G2G perspective, I'll highlight that sometimes within a company they also have complexity. 2 years back, we had a collaboration with EU to do a pilot to link up from Holland, sort of linking their single window with our single window. And we were asking around, both sides, EU and us, were asking around for pilot companies who were willing to participate. After a long, frankly, search and persuasion, we couldn't find any company wanting to do it. I think they had problems also internally to link up. And those are MNCs. Because MNCs will have different subsidiaries in different parts of country, different parts of the world. And they had problems in linking up global systems. And we recognize that it's not so easy as it is to say link up data, exchange documents, based on that example. And also based on what we currently has been doing under the trade exchange program to encourage companies to link up, automate, etc., which you don't see that coming. It's logical solution. No one will dispute the logic of it. Technology is there, no issue. There's some form of government funding here and there for SMEs. But still, you don't see that much people or companies taking up this approach of linking up systems so that data can be recycled, can be reused, you improve data accuracy, you improve productivity, etc. You don't see that ramping up. We always wonder why. Is it because that is not the foremost important thing for companies, that their concern is more about bread and butter, about revenue, so this is something that's less priority? Or is it a resource issue, or is there something hindering data exchange or connecting systems? That's something they always ponder.
Or maybe, in my experience also, is it the customs and trade part of systems integration that's sometimes the problem? Because other parts might be much better integrated. But we see it even with some of the providers on there. A lot of companies implement an ERP, but not the customs and trade component of it, because there's just not enough there. Maybe Raymond, I'm not sure. What's your experience been? You've just kind of changed employer because your organization merging with another one. Is that something you run into immediately, that the systems don't, or is it too early to say that they're so separate that you're not even looking at making them communicate?
Yeah. So I think from a business perspective, I mean, we are still running on our own ERPs. The integration hasn't started. But back to the point where my fellow panels has actually commented about having one single window with the same connection between two systems. But one thing which I think companies are kind of taking a wait-and-see approach is that some of the questions of the fundamentals of the principles of, for example, HS classification, product classification, valuation, and etc. The difference between countries, kind of based on what we have experienced, is taking different approach. Not, let alone cross countries, within the countries. I think if Scott, maybe he can comment earlier that some of the challenges the industry is finding, for example, if I classify a product under 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, if you use a single window and transmit to another country, they might not agree that it's supposed to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So my thought is that, I mean, at least this is more my perspective, is that unless we are able to really align in terms of that fundamentals, I think even if there's a single window, I think companies would be kind of concerned in terms of how it's going to, will it smoothen my operations rather than it hinder my operation when I submit something over from Singapore, for example, to China? Will China accept that classification that we have done in Singapore? So while from a system perspective, it's a single window to be done, but I think while negotiation perspective, the fundamental principles I think has to be taken into consideration. Scott, how about yourself?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Raymond. And I guess when we talk about the single window initiative, I think we all get excited about how that may expedite the process. But more importantly, I think the predictability is the key. Our businesses can adapt to a 10-day turnaround or a 20-day turnaround, provided it's planned into the supply chain. And where I get people knocking on my door with issues is when we've told them 10 and it's turned out to be 20. So this is what I think is one of the big challenges of the single window, is getting that standardization so that I can go to my businesses and give them some sort of assurance that they can move their goods into India, Indonesia within reasonable time frames and accurately be able to estimate what those time frames are and particular challenges they'll have. But just speaking more broadly about that point, and I think this is where we as industry have a role to play, and I guess it's an evolution of trade compliance professionals. I've seen a change here. When I started this role many years back, it was very much compliance focused. But in more recent time, my role has become somewhat of an advocate. And when I say that, we've recognised that while there's a lot of government-to-government discussion around trade facilitation, there isn't a lot of G2B. And companies are often, as Tik Leong just mentioned, reluctant to get involved. We'll wait for someone else to take the lead, right? Why do we want to invest our time and effort in something that may not eventuate? But if we all take that attitude, then things do move very slowly. And what we're recognising in HP is that, for a small investment of our time to talk with government, and that's government across the region, to assist them with some of these decisions is well worth our time, because not only do we get the inside running as to what they're thinking, but in many cases we can influence their decision. If we can demonstrate to them that the decisions they're making, how they'll impact business, whether it's positive or negative, then that helps us, and also, more importantly, helps them to decide on which way they go. So Hewlett-Packard, we're stepping up in this area. I work very closely with our corporate affairs team to ensure that we're engaging with government on trade-related matters, and I think other like-minded companies are starting to recognise that if we want to see some of these benefits eventuate, then we simply can't leave it to government. We have to take an active role.
So lots of issues to remain or to remain to be resolved. I just want to come back to Greg with your kind of history and affinity with the 3PL industry, and there's quite a few 3PL players here in the audience, I think. So when you listen to all these challenges, corporates, the system providers, the authorities, 3PLs are positioned in an area where they might be ideally positioned to help out. Are they doing enough? Are they getting things right? I know we did a panel about a year and a half ago where we had a couple of corporates and a couple of 3PLs on the same panel, and it became quite a lively discussion of the corporate saying, well, this is what the 3PL saying, well, this is not my responsibility, and the corporate saying, well, that's what I'm paying you for. What's your view?
No, I agree that there is some disconnect, clearly, I think, between some shippers, not all. I guess it depends upon the evolution of a shipper themselves and how many trade compliance people they have and how experienced their trade compliance people are, I think, in terms of their expectations on their 3PLs. From the 3PL's perspective, with the exception of Singapore, where in Singapore sometimes the 3PLs actually do act as an importer and exporter under their own name, and so they bear the legal responsibility themselves. But in most countries, they don't necessarily bear that legal responsibility or only partially. And so their expectation is, of course, that the information that's being provided by the importer of record or the exporter of record is accurate. And in most cases, you know, the shippers are not necessarily willing to pay the 3PL extra to verify that information, or they don't necessarily proactively provide them, you know, with enough information to, say, properly determine tariff classifications. And so there's, you know, I think that there's probably some kind of service level disconnect there many times that, that hopefully can be overcome with time. I think that some of the 3PLs are, you know, a little bit more active than others, and it's probably a good area of opportunity for them, actually, to be able to differentiate themselves a little bit, to kind of maybe step up their game a little bit, you know, with regards to understanding trade compliance and making sure that, you know, where they can control their own activities, that they're doing so in a meaningful way.
So we talk a lot about trade compliance, trade strategy in the supply chain, everything that might be required. A pressing question, I'm sure, for everybody is, well, how much does it all cost and what does it save me? How do you put a number on this? So I'm going to go around a little bit. Who shall I start with? I'm going to start with Scott at the end there and work our way. So, you know, is there a way of measuring the cost and the benefit of trade compliance? And if so, how do you do it?
Very topical question, particularly within my organisation, because we report into controllership, so everything's a number. You know, what does it mean in terms of dollars? So we've struggled with this, but we've come up with some basic metrics, and a lot of them are really not necessarily rocket science in the sense of turnaround time. But the one we struggle with is demonstrating to business the avoidance aspect. How do you measure something that you've avoided? Okay, it's much easier to quantify something that you've achieved if we've had an audit, for example, in Thailand, and we've been successful in resolving an issue that potentially could have ended in multiple millions of dollars of fines. That's easy to quantify. But when we've said we've had a good compliance record across Asia, and we haven't had any major exposures in the last 12 months, how do I demonstrate that to management? Very difficult, and I'd be open to ideas from other panelists. But we struggle as a team globally with this. I mean, HP's global trade team, there's about 80 of us globally. So it's one of the largest worldwide, and we're still struggling to try and find ways of making our value add visible to business in financial terms. Easy to report it, but in financial terms, we struggle, I must admit.
From your perspective,
Yes,
how do you measure the benefit you could bring to organizations?
Yes, absolutely. And I think so that's something that can be done, which is, of course, very specific to your organization. But equally, you know, you do operate in an ecosystem where other industry, players run across absolutely the same challenges and avoid the same challenges. So again, I go back to my previous point, which is that I think as an industry, I think that is a standard problem, which is how do you actually quantify the business case for the investments into the trade compliance team and into the trade compliance tools. And as you said, there is a cost aspect to it and there's an avoidance quantification aspect to it. And so as far as costs go, of course, that's all proprietary, and so you can maintain that. But I think perhaps, Frank, this is something for folks like you to consider, right, given where you are in the system, that, you know, maybe there might be something that you could create from an industry standpoint, which just starts to document what real costs of avoidance, and build cases, case studies, develop standard numbers. Just like you've got thumb rules for everything else, you perhaps might be better positioned to create such a case.
Teaches me to ask difficult questions, but I can delegate it to Greg. No, it's an interesting point, and I'll get some views from this side as well. I recall we did a study. I talked about the internal market in the EU, and after about three or 4 years, we actually did a study for the European Commission to say, well, what's it saved us? Like, what's the abolition of fiscal and customs borders saved businesses in the EU? And it was actually, I mean, I'm an econometrist by training, so I should know about numbers, but it was really hard to start thinking about, okay, how do you measure the fact that a container comes off a ship in Rotterdam, goes on a lorry, and that lorry doesn't need to stop at the German border an hour into its journey. They can continue going. Or does it still stop? And if so, if I may sidetrack for 1 second, there's a border crossing between France and Spain at Irun. And as part of our project, we actually sent people. I mean, this was one of my first jobs when I joined PwC. I wore jeans and a checked shirt. And I sat in truck stops at borders to talk to lorry drivers about how their life has changed. And an interesting, so it's completely extraneous fact, was that at Irun, many of these lorry drivers had girlfriends. So previously, their 10 hours clearance would be spent, and it would still be 10 hours, even though customs didn't require it anymore. So you never know how to measure these kind of impacts. But yeah, so the benefit of avoidance, it's amazing. If you do something today, which means that in a year's time you've violated US export control regulations and you're prevented from exporting for 6 months, you know, the cost to a business is astronomical. It may even put you out of business. But that's kind of not something you want to take to management. Well, this is the value I bring. I avoid us going out of business. Maybe some views from this side before we kind of quickly go to the floor. Neil, start with you.
I think, you know, the landscape in Singapore is changing. So, you know, bringing it back to Singapore, I think, you know, Teck Leong's team have got the job of you know, doing something which has never really been done before. Something that we've been banging the drum about, as I mentioned, you know, with Advanced Export Declaration, the penalties now go to the shippers. And that's something which, you know, we stand up and make a presentation. It's quite a shock because you know, penalties for misdeclaration go to the declarant, which will generally be a freight forwarder or ourselves. But you know, now I think the pressure is ramping up on shippers, and that is that kind of brings Singapore into line with you know, many other countries where the shipper very, very definitely is responsible. I think a lot of the pain of compliance has been borne by the freight forwarders over the years in Singapore, and that will now more equally be shared with the shippers. So, you know, it's a prod and a nudge, but hopefully it will mean that, you know, shippers here start kind of taking a greater interest in their trade compliance regime. And I think, you know, with some of the things that we were talking about earlier about automation, I think that will then generate greater interest in automation, because automation not only brings a reduction in the number of keystrokes, but also an increase in transparency and data integrity, which, you know, if you've got your HS code set up right in your system from the start, then those will simply pass through to your declaration, and, you know, there should be no reason for a misdeclaration or for some of the usual errors that we very commonly see. As far as making a case for, you know, whether you comply or don't comply, and, you know, and I appreciate the position that that Scott and Raymond must be in kind of trying to, you know, justify why you need a trade compliance team. And I guess it's, you know, it's a similar thing to what we went through many, I guess, decades ago now with safety. HSE was kind of considered a dirty word, and nobody wanted to be the HSE guy. It was kind of someone who was nearing retirement and who you know, could fill out reports. And now HSE is kind of embedded into pretty much everything that we do in a physical manufacturing environment, and certain industries obviously pay more attention to it than not. So I think, you know, as time goes on and you know, and as countries do get tighter and more focused on trade compliance, you will see the cost of avoidance becomes quite a significant amount, but also well worth paying.
Raymond, anything for you to add from your organization perspective as to how you try to measure cost and benefits?
I mean, for us, basically what we do is we look at it from a trade facilitation as well as trade compliance as a whole. So, for example, if you want to take advantage of FTAs, GSPs, and etc., you need to actually have a good system, for example, a good HS classification system to be able to support such initiative in a way. So from that perspective, I think it's much more easier for us to justify in terms of the costing to the management in a certain way. And also, in a way, like what Scott has mentioned, is that it also creates a competitive advantage. For example, if you want to go to a highly restricted industry, example nuclear, for example, you know, the level of compliance and expectation of the authorities for you to enter into the market will be very high as compared if you are, you know, just doing a consumer market. So, you know, that's where what we usually do, or at least my team does, is really to package it together with trade facilitation as well as trade compliance as a whole, rather than separating it out together. So it gives an easier approach and let the management be able to see, you know, where the value adds that our department or our team actually brings in to the organization. So that's how we do it in a certain way.
So there we go, Greg. Our challenge is to pull all this together and present next year a model for measuring cost and benefit in trade compliance. And I know we're running a bit late, but unfortunately or fortunately, certainly I found the discussion quite fascinating. So people haven't bored me, so I haven't gone to the audience and the floor yet. But are there any pressing questions other than where's lunch?
Hi, I'm from Hewlett-Packard and also co-chair on the supply chain committee of the American Chamber of Commerce. So I find that a very interesting discussion, and also the discussion, how can we go from a passive, right, waiting that regulations and trades align in the future, hopefully in our lifetime, right, to an active role, how we engage, you know, from the company side and get requests on trade alignments to the government, right? And Scott was saying, you know, HP is engaging in that in a discussion with the government. My question is there any room for panels, boards, where companies should actually define their requests in that area in order to drive this process and maybe achieve these alignments earlier than after our lifetime?
Anybody want to take that, Scott?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So, certainly I think there is, you know, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a new area for trade compliance, and I guess depending on the point of maturity in your organisation, you're going to be better at doing it than others, perhaps. Also, the capacity within your organisation. You know, we have a very active corporate affairs team globally, and we've educated them that this is a barrier to HP's growth across the region. And they've recognized that. So they routinely come to me now saying, hey, I'm going to be meeting with X minister. Is there a trade issue that I need to be talking about? And we don't only do it through our local people. When we have our global people, VPs travel through the region with messaging to governments, often trade is now one of the topics that is discussed. Various challenges that we're facing across the region. So yeah, I think there's multiple methods and ways that you can go about it, but certainly what we're seeing, and it's still early days for HP in this regard as well, it's well worth our investment because we feel that we are shaping some of these regulations and at the same time building good relationships with government because we're demonstrating that we're prepared to step up and assist them with some of these challenges because we are in a rapidly evolving regulatory environment in Asia, and unfortunately, a lot of some of the regulations in the developing parts are made on the run. They're very knee-jerk reaction. So the consultation with business is not a practice that is routinely a part of the policy making. So it will change it over time, hopefully. It's a cultural shift, but unless business play their part, you know, governments are going to be slow on the uptake.
Okay, any other pressing or not so pressing questions from the floor? If not, if people are wondering about, actually we're doing you a favor. Research shows that at these events people eat too much at lunchtime, so it's good if we run a bit late, it's good for you. No, not PwC researchers, I think. Okay, well, in that case, I would like to thank my panelists for sharing their thoughts. If you have private questions for them, I think they'll probably be hanging around over lunch and maybe longer. And certainly from my own perspective, I've worked in customs and trade consulting for over 20 years. I think in Asia, pardon me, with the growth of the economies, with the focus of MNCs and local companies on international trade, there's still a lot to do. And there's clearly a shortage of people that really know all the aspects of what that need to be managed. Automation might address some of that. Training, I think, something that certainly I'm looking at personally also within PwC and with our client base. How can we generate more knowledge in other supply chain professionals on how to deal with the key trade issues, but also in other parts of the organization. So I think lots of work to be done. So hopefully this was a good starting discussion, and thank you all for your attention.